I wanted to make a more updated video on the C-strats routes for fortress overclocking to give a more updated look at it, because there's been a lot of developments recently with it, and also a lot of misconceptions in the community of how it works. So to get started, I'm going to explain how the C counter works. So the C counter is a measurement of how many subchunks are being loaded at any given time. So the right side is how many are loaded in your world, and the left side is how many are being rendered. So if I press F3 and G, you can actually see the subchunks with these blue outlines. Okay, so the C counter represents these subchunks being loaded. So the left side is how many are rendered, and the right side is how many are loaded in your world. If your render distance is the same, the right side should be consistent as long as new chunks aren't loading. So if you enter the nether or across a chunk boundary, it will change, and that can give you an indicator of how long till your chunks are loaded. So if we want to see where the subchunks are, we can press F3 and G, and it will show us the subchunks with the blue lines here. If I put up a wall here, we can see that the counter number drops a ton when we're looking at the wall, down to 10, 13, versus when we don't have the wall here, it's up at about 300 right now, 250. Same thing with this wall, it's at 7. But this wall right here doesn't block it at all, even though it's a lot bigger, a lot closer, and a lot thicker. These other two walls were only 1 block thick, as you can see. So why is that? So the reason that is because where the chunk boundaries lie. So if we look at this wall, we can see that it's directly on the other side of the chunk boundary. So only these chunks back here are getting loaded, and nothing behind it can get loaded because they're blocking, because they're on the chunk boundary. Same thing with this one, it's just on the front side of the chunk boundary. So if we look here, the blue line's right there. But this one is on neither end of the chunk boundary. So if we go through the wall here, you can see that it's not on this side of the chunk boundary, and it wasn't on this side of the chunk boundary either. So the last thing we need to know about the C counter and what it renders is the fact that it only renders chunks if they contain something other than airlocks and also aren't fully filled unless they are bordering a rendered chunk. So if we look straight up, you can see only 4 chunks are getting rendered. And that's this chunk, that chunk, that chunk, and that chunk, because they're all kind of in frame here. If we fly up further though, you can see that less and less chunks get rendered till there's no chunks that we can see on screen that have any blocks in them. So how is that effect useful? So that effect is very useful because we end up with an effect like this where we get more of a surface area of the area we're looking at and not just the volume of the area that we're looking at. So as you can see here with nothing there, we only have the half the chunks loaded in this model here. Whereas with the fortress, we have a large amount of chunks being rendered. And also this means with dead ends that we will end up getting low numbers too. So what ends up happening is your C counter will generally bring you to a fortress or a more open up area. And that means that you can find your fortresses either directly off this or you can find them with your high FOV. So on average with 16 render distance, I've been able to get about 500 on average for my C counter with with minimum FOV. And if you're at 200, not 200, 20 render distance, it's about 700, 750. But there is a small caveat to that. So if you'll notice when I'm looking around, in the corners the number is a bit higher than when I'm looking straight. And the reason for that is when you're looking on a straight, you're actually looking less distance than when you're looking on a diagonal. So with these two, with this model, it's the exact same degrees here, here, and there. We only have 27 blocks or chunks filled in here. And on this one we have 27 chunks because they're the same, because it's rotated. But on this one we have 37, which makes it so that there is a 0.7 difference between the diagonals versus straights. So if we multiply the number we get on a diagonal, it ends up averaging it out basically. And you want that's kind of if you're looking half and half, you want to like multiply it by 0.8 or 0.9 depending on how much. And that should average out your numbers to be a more consistent number. The next thing you want to be aware of when doing this is how terrain and biomes and other structures can affect your number you'll be reading. So if you have terrain that is very jaggedy and all over the place, you'll get a still high surface area similar to a fortress, which can mess up your reading. So you have to be aware of the terrain around you. Terrain that is closer, or in this section of the reading, isn't going to have as much of effect as readings in this section because the area is so small. So things that are close to you don't have much of a big impact, whereas things that are further away do. Forests can also have an effect just because the trees stick out more and end up rendering more chunks. And bastions can also affect the counter, so you have to be aware of that. And you should always prioritize E over your C counter. So if your E counter is telling you there is a bastion in a quadrant, you should assume that that quadrant's bad and you shouldn't listen to the C counter. The last thing to be aware of is how your direction you're looking vertically can affect it. So if you're looking up or down, you're going to see a lot less distance than if you're looking in a straight line. So you have to be aware of how that affects your C counter. And it's a lot more of an effect in the nether than it is in the overworld because we have a ceiling and a floor, whereas in the overworld we just have a floor. And now I'm going to show you an example of a bastion that the C counter wouldn't be able to find. So if we come to this fortress here, it appears that this fortress is very open and visible to the world. But in reality, um, no chunks in this fortress are actually visible by the C counter because this right here is taking up this terrain's there, this terrain's there, that terrain's there, this terrain's doing this one, the ceiling is getting this one. So this is as if this fortress wasn't here, it wouldn't look any different on your C counter. So you have to be aware it's not going to find every fortress. It's only going to find open fortresses, but it will help you find areas that are more open in general, which will help you find more fortresses quicker. If you want to see the C counter in action, I have linked a 20-minute video in the description, so you can go check that out. And it's just me using the C counter over and over again and showing that it works pretty decently. So yeah, that's all for today.